Hi, everyone. Today I want to talk about why I decided to read the CES letter finally after a couple of years of not going to church, what I thought about it, and why I think that it's a good idea for ex-Mormons who haven't read the CES letter yet to read it. So, to start off with, I want to explain why I didn't read it for a couple of years. If you've watched my first video that I uploaded to this channel, I talk about why I actually stopped going to church in the first place. And in that video, I explained that it really didn't have anything to do with the CES letter or other sources that are considered anti-Mormon. It had to do with my relationship with the Book of Mormon and my feelings about how I had gained a testimony of certain gospel topics in the first place. And so what led me to leave really wasn't anti-Mormon in any way. But after I stopped going to church, I started interacting with other people who had stopped going to church or had removed their records from the church for other reasons. And that was when I realized that there was a whole swath of information that is not talked about in church that really makes the church look bad. And the way that I had thought about it was that when you're in church, you're told that anti-Mormon literature or anti-Mormon websites make the church look bad because it's information taken out of context. However, when you actually look into it farther, the perception that I got just from hearing people talk about it and listening was that you realize that the church's information, the information that they tell you in church, is actually the out of context information. And the information that they tell you in the anti-Mormon sources actually gives you better context most of the time. And that was something that I thought was really interesting. And that was how I felt that I gained the whole picture of what was going on, even though I hadn't actually looked into any of this information myself. It was just something that I heard secondhand. And that's why I became more comfortable with the fact that I had left church and wasn't ever going to go back. However, during all this time, when I was hearing this from other people, I never actually looked into the information for myself, and I never read the CES letter or letter from my wife or any of the documents that I could have read, any of the quote-unquote anti-Mormon stuff that I could have read. And the reason I didn't was because, in my opinion, since I already wasn't going to church, I kind of felt like I didn't need to, because I was already not going to church. So why would I read something that would convince me not to do something that I already wasn't doing? And so that was my thought process, and that was why I didn't actually look into anything myself for a couple of years. But now it's 2021, more than 2 years after I stopped going to church. And I want to get into why I actually started to look into stuff by reading the CES letter. And what happened was I realized that a lot of ex-Mormons, a big chunk of ex-Mormons, became ex-Mormon in part because of the CES letter. And I was kind of separating myself from that portion of the ex-Mormon community by not even knowing what was in the CES letter specifically. Now, I knew a lot of the stuff that was in the CES letter just from having heard it, but I didn't know what stuff was in the CES letter and what stuff wasn't. And that disconnected me from a lot of people. So I decided that in order to be able to understand what somebody actually meant when they said, I read the CES letter and then I decided that the church wasn't true, or I read the CES letter and then I did more research and then I decided the church wasn't true. I decided I really need to know what specific information is in the CES letter. So I started reading it. I think I started reading it on Saturday last week and finished it on Sunday. I might have started it on Sunday, I don't remember. But I know I finished it on Sunday. And I wanted to give my thoughts on the CES letter, different parts of it, and just as a whole. So to start off with, I want to give my first impressions. And my first impression as I was reading the very beginning of the CES letter was that it could have been better. It started off with information about the Book of Mormon, and it had this really interesting claim that I thought, if this is true, this is, you know, really damning for the church. And it was that the Book of Mormon contains errors that were specific to the specific edition of the King James translation that Joseph Smith had. So not even specific to the King James translation, but specific to the specific edition that Joseph Smith had. Which, if you think about it, that sounds pretty bad. If that's true, that sounds pretty bad. But then there were no examples of that in the actual document. And I didn't click on the link that he gave. So, maybe that was a really good claim with really good evidence to back it up, but he didn't provide any evidence for it in the actual document. And then right after that, he says, oh, but there are italicized words in the Book of Mormon that were in the King James Version, and that's weird because none of these words were in the original version, in the original documents that they translated from, but they show up in both the King James Version and the Book of Mormon, the exact same italicized words, which sounds weird unless you realize, which I do, that those words were kind of put in there as words in order to make the translation even understandable. Because I haven't studied Hebrew, but I've studied Chinese. And when you translate from Chinese to English, you need to add a lot of words for which there is no exact translation in Chinese. And the reason you need to add them is because otherwise it doesn't make sense, because Chinese grammar is very compact. They say a lot of things like, I need go store, for example, is like the word for word translation of a sentence somebody might say. And so adding, I need to go to the store would be adding words, but you need it in order for it to make sense in English. And so I kind of felt that the Hebrew to English translation, or whatever language they were using to English translation, was the same way. And because of that, it didn't really bother me that the exact same italicized words, the exact same helping words were in the Book of Mormon version of verses as were in the King James Version, because I felt like, well, obviously those words are needed. So it was frustrating to get a claim that sounded pretty bad, but then have no examples for it, and then have a claim that doesn't bother me at all and have a ton of examples for it. So that was my first impression of the CES letter. I was kind of like, this could be better, and this is a bit frustrating. But I kept reading, and that's when I got to my favorite part of the CES letter. And I'm going to talk about my 3 favorite parts of the CES letter now, and why I think they're important, and why I think that I should have read the CES letter sooner because of these 3 parts. And the first part that I came across, and actually my favorite part of all these 3 parts, is the discussion of the Book of Abraham. And the reason why I thought this part was so good is because I actually have read apologetics surrounding the Book of Abraham before. I did that years ago before I ever left the church. And they said things like, well, the scrolls don't match what Joseph Smith said, but we don't have all the scrolls anymore, so that could have been on the scrolls that were lost. And I just went along with it like, okay. But here's the problem. The problem is the facsimiles that are in the Book of Abraham, we do still have. And they were reviewed by Egyptologists. And they were completely different, according to the Egyptologists, than they were according to Joseph Smith. Not only that, but one of the facsimiles was incomplete, and Joseph Smith drew in extra stuff to complete it. And the Egyptologists who looked at it were able to show actually it would have looked more like this in the part that was missing, as opposed to what Joseph Smith drew. And I just thought that was really interesting because looking at the two pictures, I could see just from what I've seen of Egyptian art, which is not much compared to an Egyptologist, obviously, what the Egyptologist did looked a lot better to me because Joseph Smith assumed that the clothing would cover the man's whole body, and the Egyptologist did not. And just based on what I've seen of pictures of Egyptian art, that just looks more Egyptian to me, to have it not covering his whole body. And so that's just the most fundamental example of why it rang true to me, even though I didn't look into it any farther, of why the Egyptologists were right and Joseph Smith was wrong about these facsimiles that are in the Book of Abraham. And then there's, of course, all sorts of things that the Egyptologists have said about it. They're basically able to interpret these facsimiles in more detail than the interpretation Joseph Smith gave, because a lot of what he said for some of the facsimiles was, this has not been revealed at this time and cannot be revealed at this time. But the Egyptologists just straight out said everything they knew. And that makes a big difference when you read line by line so many things that the Egyptologists know about these facsimiles that Joseph Smith said just weren't true. And when you look at that, I don't really see a good apologetic answer for that. And that's not something that I read about when I read the apologetics things earlier, that it's the actual facsimiles that are wrong. And I just don't see a way around that. They're just wrong. And they were in the scrolls that remain. And the stuff that surrounds the scrolls is a funeral document. And the apologists were like, oh, well, we assume that the text that we have is the same text that Joseph Smith translated. And yeah, we have reason to assume that because it was right next to the facsimiles. And the facsimiles were used by Joseph Smith and referred to in the Book of Abraham as being close to the text that Joseph Smith was translating from. So there's just, it's just really funny that the apologetics that I read were so misleading, I would say. And it was really nice to be able to get that information because I had heard about the Book of Abraham, but I hadn't realized how misleading the apologetics on it were. And so to be able to see, wait a minute, this is very, very clearly a fraud when you look at it, just made me feel a lot more, it gave me confidence in my decision not to be going to church anymore that I didn't know I needed. Or I didn't know I wanted. And that was something that I really liked. And that was the main benefit I got out of the CES letter. And that's why I think that people who aren't going to church anymore, who haven't read the CES letter, should still read the CES letter. Because you learn things in there that you might not know otherwise. ceremonies. And that was the main thing. That was my favorite part, the Book of Abraham's discussion. But there were two other parts that I thought were really useful. The first one, if I remember correctly, was the discussion of how people gain testimonies. And it talked about how you can get a testimony of the Book of Mormon, but so do people from all sorts of other groups who believe in the Book of Mormon. And they use that testimony of the Book of Mormon as evidence for the fact that the Book of Mormon is true, and then evidence for the fact that their specific church is true. You know, just because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the most popular church that believes in the Book of Mormon does not mean it's the only church that believes in the Book of Mormon. And when you look at the evidence, there's no reason, even if your testimony of the Book of Mormon was evidence that the Book of Mormon is true, which it isn't, because testimonies can be very easily manipulated, and the spirit basically comes down to what you feel most of the time, what you feel or random thoughts that pop into your head, which could have come from any source. Even if it were evidence for the Book of Mormon being true, that does not mean that the church is true. And I had known all of this before I read it, but that's the reason I really like this part of the CES letter, because I think that this hasn't occurred to a lot of the people who will be reading it. And so to see that in there, I was like, yes, that's good. And the third thing that I read in the CES letter that I thought was particularly good, and also this actually came before the second thing that I discussed, I realized, just looking over it now, was the discussion on Joseph Smith's polygamy. Now, there are a lot of things about Joseph Smith's polygamy that people could find disturbing. I think people could find the rules for polygamy that are written in the Doctrine and Covenants disturbing, and the CES letter goes over them. But what bothered me about polygamy, as it was practiced by Joseph Smith, is that he didn't follow those rules. And that's what bothers me about polygamy, just as myself personally. I understand that there are other reasons to be bothered by polygamy, and a lot of people are bothered by it for other reasons. But for me, as a person who is analytical and also a person who has never been married, so I never have had the experience of actually being completely devoted to someone and then knowing that from a celestial standpoint in the eternities, I might have to share them with someone else. I just felt that what bothered me about it the most was that he didn't follow his own rules. He married women who were already married to other men. He did not tell his wife about all of the marriages. And the other thing that bothered me about it was that he got people who were engaging in polygamy to lie about the fact that they were engaging in polygamy. And that bothers me. That just seems wrong. And like Jeremy Reynolds says in the CES letter, that doesn't prove that the church is false. But it does show that Joseph Smith lied. And that is disturbing. So that's the third part that I thought was really useful and good, because a lot of people don't know about Joseph Smith's polygamy. And I think a lot of people who think, who know about people leaving the church over problems with polygamy, think that what they were upset about was that the polygamy happened in the first place. And I'm not saying that that never happens, that there aren't people who just find out polygamy happens and can't handle it and leave. But I think what really bothers people isn't the fact that polygamy happened. It's the fact that it happened the way it did, with Joseph Smith marrying already married women and marrying minors and not telling the truth about it. I think that that is what really throws people. And it's good to know that those are the reasons why people leave, for the most part, over polygamy. So that was the three main things that I thought were really good about the CES letter. Other things that I thought were interesting was the discussion of the three witnesses and why their testimonies aren't as great or as solid as people think. That was interesting because it was interesting to find out that although none of the three witnesses ever denied their testimony, Martin Harris kind of effectively did deny his testimony because he basically confirmed that he didn't actually see the plates really in the traditional sense of seeing that we understand. It was very much a spiritual experience of basically imagining the plates. And that is a good thing, I think, for people to know. Because as far as I'm concerned, Martin Harris effectively denied his testimony of the seeing the plates. The other thing I thought was interesting about that whole section was that the author of the CES letter, Jeremy Reynolds, basically says, it doesn't really matter how good the testimonies of the plates' existence were, because Joseph Smith translated using a rock and a hat and didn't actually need the plates themselves to translate. And I think, okay, well, that's interesting. But in my perspective, the reason why it doesn't matter is because just because you know the plates are real, even if you do know the plates are real, that doesn't say anything about what the document that comes from them actually represents and whether that's actually real. Because Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham, and he translated part of this set of plates called the Kinderhook plates. And the Kinderhook plates turned out to be fraudulent plates. And the Book of Abraham turned out to have nothing to do with what Joseph Smith said it did. And so even if the gold plates that the Book of Mormon came from were actually real, that says nothing about whether the Book of Mormon is true or not. Absolutely nothing. So that's my thoughts on that. So to wrap up, I'm going to talk about the conclusion of the CES letter and then give some final thoughts. The conclusion of the CES letter is what I would say makes it make sense to call the CES letter anti-Mormon, because the tone of the conclusion is very negative towards the church and Mormonism. And I don't think that that's a bad thing, but I do think it means that people aren't wrong to call the CES letter anti-Mormon. I think that not everything that people call anti-Mormon is anti-Mormon, but I think it's okay to call the CES letter anti-Mormon, and I don't feel bad about people doing that. And we can argue about whether or not that was the best approach to take in the CES letter, if it would be better to have a document that wasn't so negative in parts. But it is what it is, and I think it's helped a lot of people realize that the church is not what it claims to be. And so because of that, I think the CES letter is still a good document overall. One thing that people who try to debunk the CES letter don't want people to figure out is that the CES letter doesn't claim to be the Word of God like the writings of Joseph Smith do. So the CES letter can be partially right and partially wrong and still be useful and still be valid, because there could be things in the CES letter that aren't true. But if there are things in the CES letter that are true, then the CES letter has still served its purpose, which is showing that the church is not what it claims to be. And so that's my take on the imperfection of the CES letter, because I do think it is imperfect. Like I said at the beginning, there are things in it that I think that could have been handled better, especially if there is actual good evidence behind some of these claims that were made at the beginning. But I think it has other sections that, like I said, are really good. So that's my thoughts on the CES letter's imperfections and its conclusion. And finally, I'd just like to reiterate that I think the CES letter is a really good thing for ex-Mormons to read if they haven't already, and I wish I'd read it sooner, because it actually gives good information as to why some of the apologetics just don't work for the Book of Abraham. And it shows that the real issues with polygamy are a lot deeper than people might think they are at first glance, and that the way Mormons traditionally gain testimonies is very suspect. So just those three things, I think, make the CES letter worth reading, and especially the Book of Abraham part. And I wish I'd read it sooner, but now that I've read it, I just want to say that I'm glad I did, and I'm glad to be in the group of ex-Mormons who has read the CES letter, because I feel like a lot of ex-Mormons have, and now I know what's in it and what isn't. Like, there are stories that I know about things that Joseph Smith did that aren't in it, but that's okay. Now I know what's in it and what's not, and I know what people will have been exposed to just from reading the CES letter. So that's all. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Comment below on your thoughts on the CES letter, and if you like this video, like it and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. Bye.